Hi, I'm Arundhathi Subramaniam, and I'm delighted to be in conversation with Marilyn and Karthika. I want to just say something about the book before we move into this three-way conversation. It's a book that strikes me as anthem and as archive and as something much more, which I'll come to in a moment. I was just talking to Karthika and Marilyn about this yesterday on email. It seems to me, on the one hand, like an anthem to friendship, to community, to resilience, to conversation. It is also an archive of a historically momentous period that we've gone through on this planet, but as refracted through the lens of two wonderfully accomplished, rigorous, clear-eyed poets. And it also struck me because when I read a book, I think in terms of images. And the first image that came to me was the image of hand-holding. Hand-holding in a way that asserts that we will not be separated, we will not be isolated, we will not be fragmented. And it also, the other image that came to me was that of a wave. And the Renga form that the poets use, in fact, reinforces that. So while you have one voice saying, my heart is singing, the other says, my heart is sinking, but there's a constant sense of crest and trough and singing and sinking, but the hands stay together, the wave remains unbroken. And this to me makes it a very special book, and part of a much wider stream of a poetry of resistance, a poetry that says we will not be bullied by circumstance, we will not be browbeaten by fear-mongering political establishments, we will not be steamrolled by narratives of mistrust and divisiveness. In that sense, it is to me part of many works that are coming out of at this time that assert the triumph of conscious choice in times of contagion. And that makes it, to my mind, a significant book and one that I'm delighted to be in conversation with the authors about. So Karthika and Marilyn, congratulations. And I'm going to start by asking you both the obvious question of how this book came to be.
I'm trying to remember exactly when it was, but I know I suggested to Karthika that we do something like this when we were all confined and could only meet each other for moments on street corners when it wasn't raining, and in part because. Well, I think especially because I know Karthika, well, first of all, she's a wonderful poet, but second of all, she's as interested in various poetic forms that come from various places, as much as I am, and also because we had both done works in collaboration with other poets before, so it wasn't a completely strange endeavor for each of us, even though the other works were quite different.
Yeah, it was actually mid-March that Marilyn asked me. She had just come back from Beirut and come back, with barely a day to spare before international borders closed, and several of my friends had found themselves in the same situation. I was more immobile than I'd ever been in my adult life, simply because it was, I'd begun several cycles of chemotherapy, and my year was predicated by hospital more than ever. And I remember Marilyn's email coming in between, I think, my second and third cycles of chemo. And I leapt at her idea, for one, because I've learned so much reading her. She mentioned that I'm keen on form, and she is one of the people from whom I've learned about various forms. And to write a book of Renga with Marilyn at that time You spoke of hand holding, Arundhathi, which is such a powerful and evocative image. It was a hand, sent out to the distance, held out through a physical distance, but which was to be more than body, and it was also a way to chronicle both body and time.
And it was a hand holding a hand, having a hand held out to me too, having this rupture caused by I was spending a year teaching at the university in Beirut, and suddenly just having to drop everything, pack what I could in a duffel bag, and leave Africa with what I had with me there, and come back at 24 hours notice before they closed the airports down. So I was very, very, very happy that Karthika wanted to do this. It was something to hold on to, coming from just when the world was closing down, rather than if it's Sunday I could go to Dubai, and then suddenly you couldn't go home again, don't go anywhere.
Something to hold on to. That's the metaphor in many ways I think we're going to be returning to. And it in fact brings me to I just want to ask you both this, it makes me curious, because you mentioned, Marilyn, that you've collaborated in the past with another poet. So does Karthika.
I
know, I'll come to Karthika in a moment. I know that Karthika and Sampurna have collaborated, and perhaps there have been others as well. So clearly, these were very distinct times. What made this collaboration different? Was it different? What were the, I assume, and this happens always at the start of a project, one starts with a certain idea of where this might lead, and then it takes you somewhere utterly unexpected. So tell us something about the process. What were the challenges? What were the surprises? How was this different?
I think for one, those were rooted in a certain knowingness. I mean, I as you know, I work in dance, and I script with my choreographers, I script with other writers, sometimes alone, but it's a constant back and forth. Even if it's not with writers, it's with the composer. For instance, when I write a libretto for an opera, there was no project, at least for me. It was the instant itself. Even with Sampurna, which was a glorious adventure. But we knew we were going to write about the metro. I mean, in my case, the metro. In her case, the Mumbai local. So there were at least some sort of frameworks to all of these. With this particular, with a different distance, which became a different distance in retrospect. It was very much in the immediacy of the day, and of what was percolating into our consciousness. Some of it happening very far away, but immediate because it was happening to people we cared for or to lands we cared for.
Yeah. And it was a way both of making some sense out of nonsense, a kind of lifeline to hold on to when everyone was shut up in their own flat and not supposed to see anybody, and only meant to go out to put your nose in the supermarket or the fruit and vegetable market, as long as it took to buy something to eat, and it was a way of both of communicating, examining what was going on, that was somehow easier to do in two voices, and getting this is what I'm going through, what are you going through, this is what you're going through,
so I'm curious. I'm sorry. I'm curious. Were there also letters going on between the two of you? Because on one level, this almost reads like a kind of epistolary chain, between two people. But were there also prose emails going on between the two of you during all this? I'm assuming there were.
Yes, because these were usually at the bottom of an email. So they're Renga. So at the end of the day, yes. We are poets, and we have structure, and we have something to say to each other in a poetic voice, shall we say. But there was also an email saying, I mean, this is what happened to me, for instance, very much in my, when you look at the dates, you'll see that Marilyn's responses are instant. Mine were really variable depending on the state of my body, of treatment, of exhaustion. And, you know, there are periods when I respond relatively quickly, and there are periods of silence for 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
But they weren't silences of 2 or 3 weeks, because Marilyn would worry. So, you know, whether it was an email which said I can't write, or it was a phone call, those were happening in parallel. Absolutely.
And having, it was years ago, but having gone through chemotherapy myself, I have some idea what that was, but also that one doesn't become brain dead, and that there's nothing better than a project that one is interested in to get through it.
Mm-hmm. In fact, I do want to come to readings very soon, but before that, I just want to also ask you about your title. Did you know that this is what it was going to be, or was this something that emerged from the text itself?
It emerged from the text.
From the text. Mm-hmm. But I think it would be interesting if both of you shared something about what this entire experience has meant to you. I know that for me, in many ways, and I think this is true for many others, that our ideas of time and space just turned inside out and upside down. And on the one hand, there were these gaping distances. On the other hand, there were what you call, Marilyn, the pandemic intimacies of WhatsApp and Facebook and all the rest of that. And it was a deeply disorienting time in many ways. I was struck by the fact that in your poems, as I read them, they took me right back to a certain moment when time moved or barely moved. You know, there are these images of preschoolers playing COVID tag, Karthika, in your poem. Or there's Marilyn's poem where she speaks of waving to the young woman on the 5th floor and her waving back, or just cutting aubergines. And it felt like these were moments frozen in time. And that sense of leadenness of that period, that came back to me very, very sharply. So I just want you to both to share something about what this notion of distance and time has meant to you during this period. And then maybe we can move into readings.
Time seemed both to expand and to contract. Sometimes, I think you know, you went through it as well. Sometimes a day seemed to last for a week, and sometimes a day seemed to last for an hour and a half. I think that is part of what went into it, the sense of time no longer being what it was. Well, today I'm going to do this, and tomorrow I'm meeting so and so, and I think we were both fortunate in that we had work, not just the work we were doing with each other, but work writing, translating, literary editing, that was done at a distance anyway, so that at least didn't stop. And that was, I know I felt more fortunate than somebody who was completely cut off, not only from their way of earning a livelihood, but from what interested them and what sparked their imagination and their ingenuity. Now I think I've lost track of the question.
No, that's fine. The idea really was to go back to the texture of that moment. What about you, Karthika? Is there anything you want to say?
Yes. I mean, 3 things which might seem contradictory, but time had never been so calibrated, but that was very much related to the fact that I was on an intensive, treatment schedule. And even on days when I was not in hospital, because of one thing, all my specialists were extremely rigorous about was the need to get rid of toxins. So my found family had never been so present. Someone was coming every single day to ensure that I, could walk for an hour or an hour and a half. And I couldn't walk alone because I have a porta cat. I had, nausea, fluctuating blood pressure, etc. So someone was always with me. So I'd never been so surrounded by attention and physical presence. Because, this is what I call my found family, and they've always been there. I'm the one who's been peripatetic. I'm the one who's never at home. I'm never in Paris for more than 2 or 3 weeks at a stretch. But here we were all kind of stuck, and all kind of all their attention. Some of them did not go away as many people did, to bigger houses, to countrysides, to families, just so that they could be with me, because I couldn't go to groceries or pharmacies. So people were taking care of my life for me, and time therefore was very present and very immediate, and hurtling forward. Touch went missing.
Yes.
That was the one thing, even with so much presence. And I had a lot of, love in my life and attention and care. But touch, with reduced immunity, with the masks, with all of that, the 1 meter we were supposed to keep from each other, touch went missing. Performance went missing. And that meant that all the markers in that sense of life, of work, just vanished. We had no rehearsals. The productions we were working on, the premieres that were to happen, they just vanished as though they'd never existed, and we had no idea when they would return. So in that sense, time just became a black hole.
Yeah. Let's have some poems. Let's hear the poems. Get a sense of the book.
Well, I think we'll begin at the beginning, which always seems sensible. And
do you need more light?
No, I can. Crocuses, primroses in lockdown, Square Leopold Achille, the plague spring. Rana sent me a photo of police on Hamra Street enforcing curfew. The boy I watched on the roof of the refugee squad was locked down already, daily, among washing lines. March 29th, 2020.
Daily lines burgeon on Louis Blanc pavements, each sprout 5 feet from the next. Human unblossoms outside baker, butcher, grocer's doors. One out for one in, gloved, masked, sanitized, before and after each yield. The pigeons strutting the same sidewalks heed no distancing. 30th March 2020.
Distance between us, she wrote long ago, and then made it permanent. Charpentier vêpres la Vierge while I'm doing the dishes on the comforting old squat black CD player. For a moment, there's connection, if only with that perplexed self desiring. 30th March 2020.
That desire for self to be more than terra firma for virus settlements, begets new creeds. Parisians grunt and wheeze praise the Lord jogging, while roaming, forlorn as our streets. Romans hymn and drum volare from balconies. Jack Bernard downs 10,000, yes, minutes of bones, libation of eyes and wits to fair agent booth. The right mantra for Loklak spurs my quest across the net. 31st March 2020.
Across the street, a girl stands lengthily at the window, smoking and looking at empty sidewalks, sun-soaked on April 1st. I wish the tourists would disappear. Now they're gone. Watch what you wish for. In Purda, in quarantine, I dice one more aubergine, April 1st, 2020.
Aubergine once more, braised, buttered, basil and beef fried, in any form. The thought invades August noons, leaves sharp pug marks on my brains these still wintry nights. Preschoolers play COVID age tag in our courtyard. Not more than 2 at a time, and catch with an outflung glove, April 3rd, 2020.
We drove out to the place they called Quarantina, where crews of ships from Europe once waited 40 days to be declared plague-free. Desolate still, but in a lonely high-rise in a vast gallery, the 90-year-old painter's new gouache texts tapestries. Afterwards, a huge Armenian lunch in Burj Hamid with my 2 young friends, nobody knowing quarantine was just starting. 3rd April 2020.
Bedlam just started here. N writes from New Delhi's migrant worker camps. How will they lock down millions who have neither doors nor roof? Millions who must walk many moons to reach a home to self-isolate. Prime Minister Modi bids his nation to light candles. President Macron, meanwhile, warned us off face masks unless really ill. Spring. The dirt in my 2 lands of roses for all the graves. 4th April 2020.
It's truly, I mean, well, many of the things we've talked about, the notion of chronicle, of, a very warm, it's a very human document, that emerges through this. But I was struck by this as you were both reading, just how rooted in a very bleak, very challenging here and now these poems are. They're not poems that are taking flight into some kind of elsewhereness. And this resonates deeply with me because I wasn't able to write very much, but the little that I wrote constantly told me I had to be here. I couldn't go elsewhere. And yet, paradoxically, as far as fiction is concerned, I have a feeling things were moving differently. I was just on a jury for a fiction panel, and we found that the books we shortlisted were all books set in the distant past, either the Mauryan Empire or the biblical past, or maybe the early 20th century, but nothing from this particular moment. These were books that came out in the past year. And a bookseller told me that the books that were selling were in fact books located in this sense of somewhere else, because the present just seemed so intolerable. But I know that as a poet, I wasn't able to invoke that somewhere else. So I'm curious about how this worked for you. Was this a conscious decision? Were we just aware on some level that this was such a historically significant moment that we needed to document it?
I don't think it wasn't a conscious decision, as in either one of us saying to the other in an email or on the telephone, since of course we couldn't see each other. No, let's stay in the present moment. And I think if either one of us had set one piece, and some of them are in other countries, but not in the distant past, and not mythological figures or fictional figures, but perhaps we might have done it. But it really seemed to move both with each one of us for our individual imaginations, and where me jumping off where Karthika had left, just taking one word and where did that take me again? And Karthika doing the same thing. And for both of us, without discussing it, it seems that neither of them went off into an imagined future or an imagined past, for that matter. I think it seemed as if the project was seeing what we could mine from the present moment.
Yes, yes. Karthika?
Well, what you said about archiving, I hadn't thought of it as archiving, but I thought of the verb which is very close, which is chronicling. I was really chronicling what, was the highlight of a day. And sometimes it was there was a lot of anger as well.
Yes.
And the anger was at what was going on in the larger world, which is why there is a lot of larger world which seeps in as well. There were many things I was deeply grateful for. And I wanted to chronicle that. I wanted to chronicle the everyday wonder. I mean, I wasn't consciously doing that, but for me, when I read it now, there is a lot of chronicling of everyday wonder, of survival, of like I said, found families, so fraternities.
Yes.
Solidarity. There's no other word. It was an everyday wonder. It's one that perhaps in a pre-COVID world did not strike one as wonder. Perhaps it was easier to not see it for something so incredible. But there was also stratospheric levels of anger, the general fuckwittedness, and the advantage that was being taken of the time. I mean, let's face it, it's been an age of surveillance, it's been an age of intolerance, it's been an age of just astronomical cruelty. And somewhere, yes, and inequality, but not natural inequality, exacerbated inequality, and there was much I could do. So there was a desire to write. And Parul, you mentioned, elsewhere I had commissioned fables from us, and so I was also writing fables at the same time. But the pandemic, in one way or the other, or the inequalities of the pandemic, did enter that as well. And this is for children. So whatever I was writing was, other than stage work, which was rooted in elsewhere and another epoch and so on. But whatever I was writing for myself, so to say, was definitely had the everyday and the present percolating into it.
In fact, you have dates, the dates ground you like never, each one of you has that date. And I'm glad that each of you reads it as well when you read your poem. That's another way in which the text is so tethered to
I think they're important.
Yes. And I was curious also about what the form did for both of you, because it is a very distilled, very compressed form. It seems ideally suited in many ways to what you were both setting out to do, especially something that is so anchored in the now. And I wondered what it was. Was it also a grounding device? What was it? What did it mean to you? What did you think it would mean? What did it end up meaning?
I mean, for me, it was a grounding device. It was a shaping device.
Yeah.
It gave the paradox of, on one hand, setting out, starting to write one of these, and on one hand, not knowing exactly where it would go in terms of geography or emotion or vocabulary, and at the same time knowing exactly where it would go in terms of the length of each line and how long it was going to be. The only a slight elasticity was using the Renga form sometimes in four stanza Renga and sometimes in 6 stanza ones, which is admissible within the Japanese form.
Karthika?
As you know, I mean, and as Marilyn very often does as well. I really love sort of deploying form and diving into it. And what the Renga did, because the tanka is 5-7-5-7-7 stanzas, so it decanted the essence. I think it brought me back really to the essence. There is no room for flourish, which I was very grateful for, I think. But at the same time, it allows a lot with just the way just the metrics of it, with enjambment, and there's so much you can do with that, with what each line can mean and not mean.
Yes.
And finding out how much you can say it, or not say, or describe, or imply in a really compressed form.
Which is the right moment to actually hear some more poetry. Would you like to read some?
Yes.
Can you do the second bit?
Yes.
The third one? Oh. My doctors, Burra and Blasi, Amazons with spines of carbon steel, shafts marked truth and solace, fingers the envy of neat goldsmiths, take the time to write and ring, to inquire and devise relief, with bad puns in pandemics, covering for painkillers. 23rd April 2020.
Covering her face with the mask she'll wear all night, my daughter goes to meet the patient first in the queue, midnight in the ER. Through nights in Aceh, after the tsunami, in a hospital tent, she saw herself back in school, saw herself the physician. I imagined her then, now, at a different distance. Think of her unmasking in the morning, driving home to walk the dogs. 23rd April 2020.
Home with the dogs, 4, and spouse of 5 odd decades. My dad, veteran of 3 wars, child 2 of World War II, famines, a blood-steeped partition, thunders of the virus, the lockdown, the distance from kin. The years of command futile before this covert agent. 24th April 2020.
Before I covered my head to enter a mosque, I cover my face now to go down the street. Niqabs forbidden in France, but masks like the one the Kine gave me will be obligatory. I sent a photo of my solo atheist iftar to Samira in Algiers, to Mariam in London. Next year, will we sit down together to break bread for anyone's feast?
Feast for one, gleaning breath from rotting peel and near empty cans of red beans, from garbage bins around the local monarch. Streets abandoned by traffic and pedestrians find homes with vagrants. Vagrants left unfed, unsafe, even as the cops slap fines on their unhoused hands. And leaders applaud our statewide lockdown success. Some deaths never figure, not even as nameless figures. 28th April 2020.
Known nameless spaces, figures, throw open windows up and down the street each night at 8 to applaud doctors, nurses, éboueurs, and to show ourselves to each other at the end of a locked-in day. I wave to the girl in the 5th floor dormer. She waves back. 29th April 2020.
A 6th floor dormer, a cigarette, the much-loved view of our skyline. Claire, critical care intern, sighs for one after 20 hours on breathless feet. Evening applause is sweet, but she'd choose PPE over the president's praise and eggs on grocery shelves. 1st May 2020.
Shelves in the G20 are still filled with coffee, cheese, brown eggs, gariguette, Greek yogurt, milk, wine. But I hurry, forget tomatoes, get out of harm's way, masked, gloved, as fast as I can. Food shopping once was community, communion, poison in the chalice now. 2nd May 2020.
In my chalice, now, on good days, mouthful of fresh cirrus and sapphire, sometimes nimbus, with falling sheets of vitreous heaven. That daily ramble required to expel Taxol and its unkind ilk, impossible alone, yet forbidden in company. Once more, Dr. B rides to the rescue, handing armor to my knights. Isa, Nico, Claire, Philippe bear her letterhead as shield. 4th May 2020.
A face mask as shield, or he hoped so, bearing wine and some news. Hisham walks along the corniche, open now, toward Raoche, his mother's flat, where he hasn't been in 3 months. Scholarship, maybe. Fall term in London, maybe. Frica Bildejage tonight.
You know, I realize again as I hear you that there is a way in which, and this is what made me talk of hand-holding earlier, there's a way in which one is reminded again and again that this is a poetry that refuses, for all the self-imposed isolation, it refuses to, it's not a poetry of passivity, it's a poetry of agency. And whether that agency is expressed in terms of political critique, or whether just in terms of a deep shared friendship, whether it's in terms of beauty, whether it's in terms of a moment of rage, whether it's irony, whether it's community, the various ways in which one seeks meaning in these moments, in these times, that comes through. The poems look for something that sustained them time and again. But before I ask you really what sustained you, I want to ask you something else. I know we're drawing to the end of our session, and I do want to conclude with readings, but I want to ask you first, what is it? Were you aware when you were writing these that these were poems of agency, not poems of, they were clearly not mute victimhood, but poems of passivity? They are not poems of passivity. Were you aware of this?
I think the act of just the act of writing them, the act of taking on this enterprise, taking on this project between us, was in and of itself an act of agency and a refusal of passivity.
But given that this was a time of such personal tumult as well, you know, around the world certainly, but clearly in your lives as well, and Karthika speaks of this as, you know, chronicling what is not just happening around, but in the body as well. So there is so much going around, and yet what strikes me is it's so resolutely shorn of any kind of, self-pity, no. I mean, I doubt any of you would bring self-pity into your work, but there's really none of that. There's a robustness in this work. And I wonder if you'd like to talk about that. Karthika?
Two things occurred to me while you said that. One is that a lot of it is celebration, and celebration in itself is, of course, an act of agency. There was a lot to celebrate. I wouldn't be sitting here. I wouldn't have survived if it weren't for so many people. You know, people who knew me and people who didn't. Just hospital apparatus. People who chose to do things just out of just out of sheer goodness. I mean, my referral nurse did not take leave for 6 months during, the time that I was in hospital, so she could teach the nurses from the oncology department how to just perfuse me, for instance. And that's not something that's asked of anybody. Like I said, friends who stayed on in town just to be able to help me deal with things. And come and pick me up from hospital, for instance, to stay in a bubble so that their immunity, or rather my immunity, wasn't compromised. So there's a lot to celebrate, and I think that goes into the chronicling. And and writing, my only response to the body is to write. As long as I can write, it's a way of reminding myself that the body doesn't win all the time.
Yes. And if we were to explore that a little further, really, what is it about the word? What is it about this act of writing that sustains? Is it just the act of naming something that in some way sustains? Is it the act of listing that sustains? What is it? as I was reading your book, I actually looked at the very many things that each of you draws on, whether it's music. Karthika speaks of Iqbal Bano at one point. Marilyn, you speak of Abida Parveen. Whether it's the music of a moment that comes to one's aid, whether it's a nurse's cap. There's a particular teal cap with poppies that you talk about, Karthika, something as specific as that. Whether it's Marilyn, coffee or a scone with a friend, whether it's reading Hildegard of Bingen, what is it really? If I were to ask you both, what is it about the word that holds us at such times?
The first thing that came to my mind is that putting words on paper, and at least in my case, I put them on paper first before I put them on a computer screen, is first of all both self-examination and seeing and one's reaching out, one's mind reaching out and taking stock of things other than the self and physical sensations and emotional vicissitudes. But at the same time, it's a bridge between the self and others, and writing one hopes that one has the image of a reader and the ideal of a reader. And in the case of writing these, we both knew that there always was a reader, and at that
yes.
time, at a time when everyone was cut off from everyone, and it would not be a question of meeting up with someone to talk about their book or something we had both read over a cup of coffee or a drink. The idea that there was that for each of us, one was a writer and one was a reader at the same time, and in an ongoing way, was extremely nourishing.
Were you actually responding and tweaking? I mean, were you making suggestions for each other's work or not?
No, the suggestion is in each poem, which is to say the idea of the Renga is you take a word.
I understand that. Yeah. No, I meant, were you actually workshopping on these poems together in some way? No. Okay. Karthika, would you like to respond as well?
Well, with some amount of amused irony in a sense, because most of the people I'm surrounded by, performers, makers, are very suspicious of the word. So,
yes.
My practice in that sense is a bit of a renegade act. They need it, but they're suspicious of it very often.
Yes.
I guess what I seek from it is transparency as much as it is possible, and honesty, which is an odd thing to say in the times of fake news and so much of the word being subverted. Yeah. But for lack of the gesture, I turn to the word.
Yes.
That's a lovely line for something.
I'm going to ask you both. I know we're drawing to the end of this. I'm going to ask you both to conclude this with a reading.
Yes. Yes. What I loved more than wine, pomegranate juice, or cardamom coffee was conversations. Her face or his face, preferred language. Mine was often a shurba of three that seemed to have its own grammar and history, none the same. I called Mimi today. She's locked down in London and saw her silver mane, imperious nose, grin, thought of coffees and curries. Voices, pages feed us now.
Your voice on the page, well, screens of laptop and cell phone, if precise, not poetic we should be, feeds me with mirth and thought, joy, doubt, absurdity, much needed. Through the galloping months of this fearsome time, not everyone knows why I have eluded faces, Skype, Zoom, FaceTime, WhatsApp, whatever, whenever possible. Last week, I lost my voice. Tears unspooled instead across video. 23rd December, 2020.
Lights out across the street, 5 stories of windows. The young black-bearded man at his computer screen, the small, long dark-haired woman I remember as a 20 years ago bride, all eclipsed. And you aren't far away, but the Gare du Nord might be Beijing. Though if I launch a bottle of syllables, one will return on the tide of the internet in one more possible morning.
One more loss to mourn. Usman C. Stage name Babson. Soft-hearted giant, says the press. King of the style christened house, master mover, choreographer, champion of girl power. Your queen's blood, paean to women, with 8 danseuses dynamos, sized space and time, and a much esteemed international jury's presumptions. Come back. You've just begun. Your brick red beats must sear sightlines for long. 31st December 2020.
Wouldn't the lines be long at any clinic if they vaccinated there? And wouldn't it be worth the wait? Instead, at Tante Prolongée, alone, in winter, nervous in a cluttered flat, waiting for the light of day of the next season of another person's face, 4th January, 2021.
Wear another face this year? I tell 2021. One will fear less, if not quite love at first sight. It lengthens this wait to be shielded like shadows at dusk. Or is this the cotangent the sun casts at dawn? The streets of Paris, cobblestone and bitumen and spit, have no answers to give me as I tread from 10th to 11th, 4th to 5th. But they console. We've seen worse. 8th January 2021.
No worse, there is none. Of course there is, but Hopkins voices my mood at 3 a.m, awake with head throbbing, sharp pain in the small of my back. Symptoms of distress, wanting out of confinement, of laptop screen dialogues. Nahid's bright sublet overlooking cobblestones, Mutabal, Bamya, Fairuz, familiar, now so strange, I felt sick. Nahid walked me arm in arm to a cab. 17th January 2021.
Let us arm ourselves with memory, lest all trace be swept under the new bordel de mer level of current chaos, with variant strains, stagnant vaccination drives, and other tumult. Before sunrise, January 9, outskirts of Calais, it's -3 degrees Celsius, and masked police are tearing up tents of refugees, chasing them to a hopeless, frozen dawn. 13th January 2021.
Hopeless to wait for vaccine registration or search for hours online. A few fortunate ones signed up, places filled in 12 hours. So live your life in suspension. Claire went for a pedicure in a Haussmannian flat, bought a scone on the Rue du Cherche Midi, where we'd had lunch in possible September. She's 95, seen worse, unshelves Montaigne to reread after she watches the news. 16th January 2020, sorry.
The news watched me back, pleased, more pleased than Mr. Punch had ever been. I'd dance with you if I could. Mark the date. Rachid Durandan's been named future head of Théâtre National de Chaillot, Mecca of dance in France. The heart sings. Son of French-Algerian parents, Rachid's coat of arms at Chaillot for the lustrum is one word, hospitality, which he's probed all these years. The heart sings. 13th February 2021.
I wonder, would you like to conclude with that, Karthika? I do think your last two, I would love to conclude with the last two poems in the book, if that's possible. Is that something you'd consider? Or would you like to stop at this point?
That would be a lovely idea.
Yeah, so I just want to say to those listening in that we're going to conclude with The Sound of Poetry. I just want to say from my end, A Different Distance by Marilyn and Karthika is a book to pick up, a big book to own. Over to you both.
2 hours before dawn, I give up on sleep, turn on the bedside lamp, pick up the book I put down at midnight, attempt escape to Algiers, another decade, history, someone's struggle who's not me, getting old in a quagmire city. Unfortunately, it was paradise. Solitary confinement now, food shopping, the only vestige of human exchange, though daylight lingers. 29th March 2021.
What lingers through day, month, and year will be kindness. Kindness that kept me sane and safe. Yes, even with the same unsought trifecta snapping at my heels, noisy and unfunny, save during our chats, scaffolding to laugh and weep at this, the théâtre de l'absurde of our own grandly defective bodies. In this almanac of blessings, laughter became you, and somehow springtide. 31st March 2021.
Marilyn Hacker, Karthika Nair, thank you.
Thank you, Arundhathi. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm delighted to meet you.
Likewise.